Hi, everyone. This is the third iteration of having, either a faculty or a professional invited for ACS 411 analysis of political communication. And I would like to introduce Professor Jacob Neiheisel, who is an expert on political communication and campaigns at University at Buffalo in New York, the New York State. He can speak to the media about a range of topics in these areas, including campaign ads, electoral strategy, voter turnout, and voter sentiment. He can also comment on other issues relating to elections, such as candidates, prospects, political parties, and redistricting. Much of Neiheisel's research has focused on political communication and the role that religion and religious identity play in U.S. electoral politics, including in the context of the Christian right. He is also an authority on the U.S. presidency. He is co-editor of the book Presidential Leadership and the Trump Presidency, Executive Power and Democratic Government, and co-author of the book Constitutional Landmarks, Supreme Court Decisions on Separation of Powers, Federalism, and Economic Rights. Well, welcome, Professor Neiheisel. Thank you very much for taking out of your busy time to talk to us. I provided for you the list of questions that I could compile from my students last night, and you sent to me your PowerPoint presentation, but I guess you would like to be in charge of your PowerPoint, the first part, right?
Yeah, that'll work. I'll probably bumble through this a bit. It's been a while since I presented something on Zoom, so what seemed second nature just a few years ago, I'll have to kind of refigure out.
I
But
understand.
yes, I
But
can
if,
do
if
that.
you want me, I could operate the PowerPoint, whatever you would like, or you can
I'll,
take over and
I'll
share
go
your
ahead and
screen.
yep, I'll go ahead and share if I can.
Yes, at the bottom, the green button that
There
says
we are.
share. If you have,
Um,
video, don't forget to click on, make it available for better audition.
gotcha. Let's see. Where's my? There she is. So can you see that?
Yes, yes, definitely.
Wonderful. I don't know that there's a need to go into presenting mode, but I can we can use this, and you've got the slides as well if you'd like to refer to them later. I actually
Yes,
embedded some links to some mostly interesting data sources on kinds of political communication that I think are really interesting if you were doing something of a project or were just curious about some of these kinds of tools that are being developed. So I actually don't want to talk for a really long time. I really, really like the questions that you sent in, and of course, I'm happy to answer anything additional. But I'll give a kind of brief spiel, putting together the pieces that you read from my work that are in some ways disparate, and doing this forced me to think about each of those pieces in new ways and trying to knit them together in terms of what I'm interested in overall when it comes to my research agenda. But I'd like to thank you, Professor, for inviting me to be with you. I'm very excited to do so and very excited to share some of my work and some of my thoughts about political communication writ large as a field, and share with you some of the my ideas that I have about some of the tools that are out there, and where some of the literature might be going in the future, at least from a academic standpoint. I realize this class has something of an applied focus as well, but I hope that there's some crossover appeal to people who are more oriented toward practicing politics in addition to studying political communication. Yeah, cards on the table. I used to work in politics a little bit in the campaign environment, and in terms of media, I used to host a local AM radio show here that interviewed lots of politicians. So this is not something that's entirely foreign to me in terms of practicing what I preach, but now primarily I focus on the academic side of things. So. All right, so the topic of today was, examining political communication strategies and tactics. That's squarely where I focus a lot of my work, and I think as a subtitle, I've thought to call today "Getting a Handle on, quote unquote, hidden forms of political communication," which is not something I've put a lot of thought into, but actually is something that I do with some regularity in my work, and trying to find new and interesting ways at getting data on things that are actually kind of hard to study and kind of hard to measure. So, in terms of where we start or what my starting point is, um, for a lot of my work, whether that's work that I've done on symbolic politics, work that I've done on elite communication, whether it's members of Congress and their campaign advertising, whether we're talking about, presidential persuasion, all of that is motivated by something of an assumption that I make, and that's not an uncommon one in the literature. And I cite Clifford and Jarrett here, as I do in the edited volume, saying that words often do the work of politics, and I think that those words matter. That's not a universally shared opinion in political science, in particular, where the content sometimes doesn't matter. It's really just about the fundamentals, and that candidates can basically be exchanged, and all that matters is state of the world. It matters in terms of the economy. It matters in terms of these big moving things that we can measure between different campaigns. So I not really going to push back on that view, other than at the margins, which is where most campaigns are won or lost, or where campaigns have a value added. I think that rhetoric matters quite a bit. And so I think the political language is important, or is, I guess to put it a different way, is assumed to be important by political actors. Otherwise, they wouldn't fight over it. Otherwise, they wouldn't argue about how different terms are to be applied, how different terms are to be defined. And we get several windows into this where you have, political actors, or maybe kind of interested ideologues arguing about, for instance, FDR's use of the word liberal. And you get Hayek pushing back and saying, no, that's not what I meant. You're using it wrong. That's not the way you're supposed to do this. And so, FDR presumably didn't care if he even knew that there was pushback from classical liberal circles about these kinds of things. But they absolutely do fight over language, and campaigns have at various points, if they don't have a continual person on staff doing this, have brought in experts to talk to them about how to talk to the public. I think most famously, George Lakoff is a cognitive linguist, was brought in, I believe it was in 2006, to a lot of Democratic campaigns surrounding his work on framing and his book Don't Think of an Elephant, trying to get people to package things in certain ways that are the most effective for the purposes of the campaign. So consequently, I think focus on the content of political actors' communications. By political actors, I mean something fairly broad. To be Could be candidates, could be sitting politicians, it could be people who are parts of outside groups. It could be people who are even just trying to shape the character and nature of politics, by being, today we would call them influencers, right? It's, in a bygone day, it's people writing for National Review or The Atlantic. Today, it might be somebody who has a following on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it now. So I have a pretty broad view of what I think of political actors. But it's their content of their communication with the public or other political actors, right? Communication between those individuals or those groups is often in evidence throughout the literature. This is something we focus on. And we've long been interested, for instance, and to self-promote a little bit more, in what candidates or groups say in, say, televised political advertising. I've done some work with my colleague Sarah Niebler, and on my own, about how candidates use partisan language in their advertising, how they use ideological language and the conditions under which they do that. Some work by Sides and Karch looks at, to the extent that it's possible, micro-targeting through what is otherwise thought to be kind of a broadcast medium. It's television, right? It's going everywhere, or at least it's going where it wants to within a media market. And so they looked at, ads that are targeted toward particular demographics, like older individuals. Scholarship has looked at candidate websites as another place to look to see how they're communicating with the public. And of course, and this taps into some of the questions that folks sent along, new technologies have led to new areas of study. Social media is just another source of various kinds of insights into how political actors communicate with their public, with their constituency, if they're a sitting politician, and of course, with each other at times. Not surprisingly, this has led to a focus on Twitter. Annalise Russell, I think, was one of the first to do some really innovative work looking at the content of candidates' Twitter accounts. Then, of course, newsletters are another place if we're talking about sitting politicians, in particular, members of Congress. Lindsay Cormack's done some really great work with a project she has called DC Inbox that allows you to search the content of all of these scraped or otherwise electronically collected newsletters from members of Congress to their constituencies. So those data are out there and you can use them for projects or whatever. I think that she's got a fairly permissive agreement in terms of how you can use the data she collects. And so that being said, there's a lot of limitations of this literature. It's largely, though of course not exclusively, something that relies on public sources of information. Oftentimes communications are private or semi-private between actors, and it's guarded in the sense that they're communicating strategic language or they're communicating to a very particularistic audience. And so a lot of what we can capture easily might not necessarily be the kinds of communication that matter. And of course, most of what we're talking about is rather contemporary in nature, particularly when we're talking about campaign communications. It's really since the year 2000 that we've started being systematic about collecting the content of a lot of political communications. You can go farther back. There have been projects to do things like code NRA magazines or code copies of the National Review or other kinds of things that are political in nature and are thought to reach something of a political elite or a particular constituency. But for the most part, when we're talking about campaign communications, we're talking about really 2000 and beyond is where the focus has been, and that's where you get the really good data on political communication coming to the fore. Notable exception here, unfortunately, as of yet, unpublished work, and he's out of academia now, so I'm not actually sure that it will be published. But John Henderson did some really cool work with the Oklahoma Ad Archive, which I believe is still publicly accessible, where you can go back to the 1960s or even before to look to see the content of political advertising. So it isn't just contemporary data that we have some historic data on that front. And so he does comparisons really over something of the long haul when it comes to campaign and candidate communication. So those are some of the limitations. In the sense that what might actually matter is what I'm terming, for the purpose of this talk, hidden political communication. A lot of important sources of information is just inaccessible, particularly at scale. We might be able to get little windows into how a campaign communicates with the public. We might get little windows into how particular kinds of elites are able to communicate with each other, say within an institutional environment, right? Communication between members of Congress, communication between Congress and elements of the bureaucracy. I'll give you a couple examples. Surprisingly, direct mail is really hard to track. So we think of this as a component of the ground game, like what campaigns are telling to voters that they get through their physical mailbox. And whether it's postcards or flyers or those kinds of things, it's shockingly hard to get a handle on the content of those. We might know how much was spent on the ground game through financial disclosures, right? They spent this much money with this firm that was able to reach this many people in a particular area. So we might have the geographic targeting of it. We might have some kind of quasi-standardized measure of tonnage or the total amount, but it's really hard to get a look at the actual content in many instances. Unless you're clever about it. There's a project by Magleby and Patterson that actually drew a random sample of the American public and asked them to save all the campaign mail that they got throughout the campaign season. And that was then submitted to some kind of content analysis. And then we had some sort of measure of what was going on in those inboxes. But it's not a census, it was a sample, and there's a lot of districts and a lot of states that actually were able to got missed in that process. Another example, when we're talking about communication at an institutional level between elite actors, right? Institutional actors, whip counts are rarely, if ever, made available to the public. I thought about throwing a picture from the old, an old first season episode of House of Cards on there, but I'm not sure people actually still watch that or reference it for frankly a variety of reasons. But if you're familiar with Congress, there is the position of the party whip, and they're the ones who go about basically twisting arms among people within the party. Sometimes it's carrots and sometimes it sticks. Sometimes it is, what can we do for you? We really need you on this bill. Can the various campaign committees that we are in charge of, can they do something for you to maybe soften the blow of a difficult vote for you? Or we're going to kick you off various things or limit access to these resources that the party has if you don't vote our way. And so we know this office exists. We can, through C-SPAN see that figure going kind of from person to person at times, but you don't really know what's being said. You don't really know who exactly is being targeted and through what means, unless you get lucky. And there have been a couple scholars who've gotten lucky where sometimes you find in the archives a whip count just randomly falls out of a file. And so you know who was targeted and with what kinds of means at various times. So there've been a couple articles that focus on that. But again, I go back to it's not at scale. And that's just a problem that continually pops up if you're interested in hidden sources of political communication. To be clear, my work is not exempt from that. So just to lift the hood a little bit in terms of how can we think about um, getting through this or getting through to more hidden forms of communication. This is, even though I've never really thought about it in these terms until recently, my research is actually focused on trying to measure political communication that's less accessible. Give you an example. One of the things that you didn't read for today, but looked at what are known as letter marks, and these are during a period in which there was a moratorium on what's known as pork or earmarking, which is when members of Congress are able to slide things into spending bills that gear spending toward their particular district, right? So it might be something that's actually a public good. It might be a weapons system project for the US military, but it's making sure that a little widget or a little part is made in their district. And so there was a moratorium passed on this, actually among both parties separately, that was calculated to curtail that type of behavior. However, so what you see in the aftermath of that is you see Congress just passing these very large spending bills, and then the back end going and actually individually asking different elements of the bureaucracy that are charged with actually spending those monies to direct a little bit of money their way. And so this practice became known as letter marking, where they're able to actually send this letter to the bureaucracy to try to get those funds really without it being terribly public. Even though there was an executive order that was signed, I believe under the Bush administration, that mandated that these communications actually be accessible, that could not be farther from the truth. There have been several lawsuits trying to force particular bureaucratic entities to make them publicly available, and they've actually lost. So even though there's this executive order that you would think would make these available, very few of them actually are. And the ones that we're able to get might, as we're talking about in a second, might have some biases in them. So my co-author and I, these weren't our efforts. There was an interest group that had submitted a number of Freedom of Information Act requests to get access to the Department of Labor letter marks, and we were able to gain access through their efforts to those data and submit them to content analysis. But if you're interested, for instance, in Homeland Security or DoD, good luck. It's probably not going to happen. So even though we were able to ultimately secure a look into what they were saying to bureaucracy, because they by design did not want these things very well published or very well publicized, um, it's hardly a representative look at the subject. And there's reason to believe that they might be biased in some particular way, right? Because of the ones we're not able to get access to, you oftentimes wonder if there's a reason they're able to give us some, but not all of them. So that's going to be a theme here in terms of what the problems are in trying to study this hidden kind of political communication. To get to some of the work that you might have touched upon for today, I'm interested, for instance, in measuring party mobilization over the long haul. Ideally, we want to know how parties and groups are communicating with their supporters. However, it's really difficult, or it can be difficult, to understand the reach of these messages without very specialized kinds of information. And so, in the article that you read for today, or were assigned for today, even though it's not the main focus of my inquiry, which looked at voter turnout after voting is made more difficult, a key piece of that article and a key component of it involves measuring what that reach looks like. And so, I'll talk about in a second, I was able to use the party press or information that's available on the partisan press. And these data, by the way, are public. that you can get it from my replication page through the publisher's website, or you can go right to the stores. There was an NSF grant that was given to some economists to collect these data, but they collected information on the circulation numbers, among other things, of the party press. And so even though I don't have content per se from these, um, given what we do know about the party press, which is that they were primarily read by supporters, we can use those circulation numbers, excuse me, to serve as something of a proxy for the party's mobilization efforts. To kind of set the stage a little bit, how this looked like is you go to the newsstand and you had the Republican paper and the Democratic paper, if both were available in your marketplace. And you, the partisan, were able to pick which one you were going to read. And Genskow and Shapiro, the people who initially collected these data, suggested that there actually wasn't a lot of persuasion going on. People were self-selecting into the news even then. They were picking whichever one they agreed with, and they were reading it because this was how the parties were able to communicate with each other during that time period. Sometimes across fairly, wide distances. This would even before the telegraph was invented, before certainly before the internet or TV or anything like that. So newspapers were how the parties communicated with the party faithful, with their followers, and were able to coordinate across distances. And so, we could do something very similar today with money spent on the ground game through mailers and direct mail, except we wouldn't really capture the uptake of those messages. Instead, party papers, though, are opt-in. And so people are choosing to read these by being a subscriber, by being somebody who's able to buy that. And so what these party papers do is they allow us to capture, I love this phrase, uh, what are otherwise thought of as communication sinews of war. This is how the parties communicated with their faithful. This is something I stole shamelessly from Walter Dean Burnham from way back in the day, but these are thought of as communication instruments, really above all. They're not persuading people, they're helping to mobilize and coordinate effort. And so if we know that's primarily what's going on, we can use these as something of a proxy for content that we otherwise wouldn't get a handle on. And so again, to shift to what I was actually interested in, which was a lot more focused on voter turnout and whether various kinds of reforms to the way we vote have a negative effect, and whether that negative effect can in some ways be mitigated by, in this case, parties. We see that when a jurisdiction adopts voter requirements for registration, which were thought to make voting more difficult and therefore were thought to decrease the level of turnout, where you didn't have parties circulating newspapers to a great extent, that actually does have a negative effect on voter turnout. So where you put more barriers up to the franchise, you see lower turnout. This is something we see over and over again, almost no matter where we look. Cost of voting go up, therefore turnout goes down. However, that effect more or less disappears or is negligible in places where the parties had a lot of circulation and therefore were really contesting elections in that area. So I think this is one way in which gathering that sort of hidden form of communication allows us to really get at mobilization in a way that previous studies weren't able to do so. Certainly not perfect. There's a lot of other things that could be going on, but it's one piece of the puzzle that we didn't really have before. In terms of other sources of communication that are kind of hidden, communication between presidents and other elements of the bureaucracy are one of them, or communication among justices on the Supreme Court. Turns out that justices' personal notes and their internal communications, they're famously unavailable. It's a very secretive institution until well after their deaths. And so some political scientists made really good use of the personal files of Justice Blackmun when he passed away. And I think that they were still embargoed for something like 5 years after that. Um, before they were able to look at, okay, who was saying what kind of types of drafts were there circulating, and who was convincing whom, whether that's with respect to oral arguments or with respect to personal communications between the justices. That's just things that we didn't know about the process that we now do. So what's the answer for me? Well, it has been historically archival research is one way that I get at this, and then FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act. Here in New York, we have a parallel provision at the state level called a FOIL Act, Freedom of Information Law. I presume the same is the case in Illinois, that they have some measure of a freedom of information law where you can basically petition for information that otherwise you wouldn't have. Sometimes it returns a big fat, we're not going to tell you that. I've had that before, for frankly questionable reasons, but that's what we got back. So I had one turned down on, I think, security grounds, that it was too much information. We couldn't know this particular thing we were after because it would give us a window into, something we weren't supposed to look at. So I disagree, but that was where the process ended, unfortunately, for that particular project. So doing these kinds of things, the FOIA requests and trying to get into archives, we found, for instance, and this connects with the Trump chapter, presidents have historically exercised both power and persuasion, in the sense that they use the formal tools available to them in their office, chiefly executive orders, but through the lens that we were looking at, we were looking at executive orders on housing, and we found a lot of crosstalk and a lot of drafts going back and forth between the president and various subordinates, members of Congress. And so this thing that we think of as this unilateral tool of power that the president has is really radically shaped by not just other actors in the bureaucracy, but other institutions. And so if we're going to use this as a measure of this is the president's preferences, it probably stands to reason that we should take into account, well, it's not just the president's preferences, but it's shaped by, in this instance, communication that he has with other kinds of stakeholders and other kinds of interested actors. So that was sort of the point that was underlying a lot of that Trump chapter, and saying that this is historically something presidents have done, but at least at that point we were writing, we didn't see a lot of that openly from the Trump presidency. And we probably won't have a good view into that until all of the public papers are available and they're searchable by different kinds of topics, and you can see, to the extent that it was recorded, you can see what was going on inside the Trump White House. So in terms of some recommendations for studying these kinds of things, history as data can actually be a really powerful resource, I think. It allows you to get things that aren't available in the contemporary era, or at least not easily so. Particularly when these kinds of things are coupled with modern tools for text analysis, whether you're using some kind of large language model or you're using some kind of coding rule to come up with that. These can be very powerful tools. The caveat, though, is one that I've mentioned before, which is there's a potential for bias. This is true for modern pursuits as well. I always use the example of one of the things I study is religion and politics, and there was a whole wave of studies that were coding sermons for political content during COVID when all these churches went online. And they found actually that there wasn't a lot of politics going on in church. But the point that I continue to bring up, and every time I'm encountering one of these pieces, is you think that they actually put the sermon that was likely to jeopardize their tax exempt status on the internet, or at least without any kind of gatekeeping going on. And so it's probably not a wholly representative look at times. And that goes for the kinds of data I collect too. We sometimes get relics from history, not necessarily well-ordered data. What survives isn't necessarily what was important. And that can be difficult when we're trying to kind of recreate what was the rhetoric at the time that ended up helping to shape some kind of communicative event. So I guess that's the warning there. But thanks for inviting me in and having to give a little bit of an overview in terms of how I think about these types of things. And it was frankly very helpful for me because sometimes I have trouble fitting together the various pieces of my agenda. And when you're forced to get several of them to speak to each other, you start to think about, well, actually, this is how I think about this, and this is really what I care about. So I thank you for the opportunity to actually put that together and to be with you here today.
I think this is, thank you very much. This was fascinating. And I think it's very helpful for students of political communication. And I wanted to ask you before we get into the student questions,
Please.
I'm classically trained, and we read about orators of the past of the ancient Greece, and or at the time of the Roman Empire, and how they were qualified to talk in front of other people because they were citizens, they were persons belonging to that city state or even empire in the Roman Empire times. But at the time they were a little at least more honest. People who knew how to speak were liked by people. Maybe it was too heavy on being an emperor or a general or somebody of note, a senator or something like that. And if you were also good at speaking, then you were really liked and appreciated, and so on and so forth. You didn't have an army of people massaging your messages and improving them and clipping them and showing only your nice side and trying to explain why you exaggerated at a certain point, or you said too much, or you made a mistake, and so on and so forth. So, you know, in if you have such a huge ocean of data nowadays to cover, sometimes candidates who might be too old, candidates who might be too extreme, candidates who might not have too much in their heads, but we can, infer that they were saying something else than they were meaning, and that complicates the things. Isn't
Absolutely.
it more? Wasn't it more honest at that time? And what to do now with such a huge wave of data? Should we use AI to congregate everything?
Yeah, I mean, fantastic question. I don't know that I have a satisfactory answer to it. I think, and I have been doing a lot more on the rhetorical side of things in my own work lately. I do think there was a remarkable level of honesty, even from political actors, not that long ago, 50 years ago. The instance that comes to mind is Johnson in his internal communications with other partisans and with other, strategic actors was very clear that they were going to lose the South, and he knew that, and he went ahead with it anyways, and so was very honest with himself about what the likely effects of a policy shift from the party were going to be. And you see that with some of the Christian right. They would invite journalists to their conventions, and they would be remarkably forthright in terms of, well, we're framing it this way because it's more palatable than these other ways that we might talk about it. So we're going to have this shift towards rights rather than something surrounding religious freedom and responsibility. And so, yeah, I think that there was a time when they were much more honest, and that we think that this is a very, very crowded information environment, and that used to be something where ambiguity about a candidate's position was a negative, or at least that was the thinking. And now the thinking, because perhaps we're so polarized, is that people fill in the details with what they like to hear if they have this affective connection to the candidate or the political actor. So they'll hear what they want to. And that's not a terribly positive thing from a perspective of democracy and democratic accountability. And in terms of the answer, like cutting through the chaff, if you will, it might be AI, right? Certainly that's one way to go about it. I prefer to keep a thinking human in the loop, who is steeped in what has traditionally mattered in these contexts. I think that I'm perhaps better able to identify, after kind of saturating myself in some of these literatures, what might matter more than a machine could. But then again, those things are getting better every day and at a scary rate. So if we're trying to cut through the mix, maybe technology is our way out.
I appreciate that you want to keep them honest, and I see the helmet in the corner over there, so I expect that you will say at the end, "This is the way," right?
I didn't know it was in frame, but I'm glad that it is.
But I've seen those series. So, how do you want to handle the questions? Do you want to go through the questions that I sent to you? Do you want the students to ask you, or I should ask? If I ask usually the students to ask two questions, but because of the constraints of time, you should address maybe at least one per person.
Okay.
Uh,
Yeah,
so,
happy to do that, and some of them I can do more quickly than others. I can just kind of go through the
yes,
list,
yes,
and if
please.
there's additional conversation, somebody kind of please speak up, and or it's difficult to read one thing and also look at the chat. But yeah, I'll just go through and do the best I can. Well, this one popped up, and I'm looking at the chat now, so I'll be an
Yes,
opportunist here.
yes, yes.
How do you go about tracking whip counts? Is something we recorded as peers in our political communication sphere, or just when referencing historic archives? Um, Two ways. You would have to basically be in the gallery and know who all of the relevant actors in the gallery are if you're watching Congress. Even then, you don't know what's being said. In terms of the how we've historically done this, it ends up being something that quite literally in some cases falls out of a box that's being thrown away from the National Archives or from the one of the Senate office buildings or congressional office buildings. So it ends up being something that we get through archival methods. And there've been a couple instances where we were able to get that, but in terms of recording it now, we're not going to know what's being said, even if we're able to kind of physically watch the process unfold. We don't know what happens behind closed doors either. So if there's a an event like that that happens in public purview, we could infer. We saw this in the race for the speaker, for instance, where you'd see somebody that was a member of the party, faithful, or the kind of the core of the party would go to the holdouts and say, "Look, here's the situation." So we have that recorded. Don't know what was being said. Maybe we don't want to know what's being said. Um, terms of the questions, Inez has a couple great ones. She asked about legacy media. Uh, this is a question I get a lot, and I think that I could be wrong about this, but I don't think about legacy media and newer forms of political communication as being tremendously different. It's still a sender and a receiver. It's just a different medium. And yes, I'm aware of the medium could be the message. Insofar as insofar as anyone is able to make any sense or nonsense of Marshall McLuhan, I realize that the medium could impart something extra, but I tend to think of them as just being different ways of going about basically the same thing.
Yeah, I just
Um,
posted her question so everybody knows what we're talking about.
Perfect, thank you. That would be, I think it's a great practice, and that will allow me to go more quickly without reading them. The second question was about Trump's frequent use of executive power. I do think that that is sort of a natural outgrowth of how things have been going since at least the Bush administration and his theories about the unilateral powers of the executive office. Um, However, I think that as I talked about in the volume, at least at that point, it looked like it was supercharged in some ways in terms of running immediately to executive power. And I don't know that we've necessarily seen Biden step away from that approach, particularly when it comes to things like student loan forgiveness, right? Using executive power and then kind of daring other branches to stop him. Um, I asked about Christian right impacting political campaigns. Um, there's a great book by Marty Cohen on sort of moral politics in Congress. And yeah, depending on where a race is being run, depending on the strength or size of the sort of fundamentalist evangelical constituency that forms the core of the Christian right, particularly through the primary process, they absolutely can affect who gets the nod in those kinds of districts. And in terms of candidates who don't align with that group or can't at least talk the talk, it becomes a problem. And they're not able to get over that hurdle if they're not sufficiently in sync with what the Christian right or Christian right aligned movements want. That being said, the Christian right, I think, has been able to be very flexible, and what they're willing to say is aligned with the movement. And they're fairly captive right now when it comes to a political group, right? They're not going to have a credible threat to bolt the Republican Party coalition. And so, in that sense, a Republican politician probably can get away from their desired positions at times. Maybe not all the time, but certainly at times.
I wanted to
And a related
interject.
question is,
I
yep,
wanted to interject
please.
something here because I saw recently, just a week ago, some representations at some religious right meetings of religious right painters. who are representing, for example, Trump, like the archangel that was supposed to guard with a fiery sword the Garden of Eden after Adam and Eve were committing the sin of biting the apple, and actually they were represented in front of the White House, and then they were representing Biden and Kamala Harris naked as Adam and Eve,
Yes.
with explicit female and male organs,
Oh, yes.
and Trump in a white, veil with a fiery sword, taking them out of the Garden of Eden that was the White House. But I mean, isn't this some kind of a propaganda system that is actually sent down through their channels, religious channels, and they organize fairs and places where you can buy such representations for a
Yes.
lot of dollars, and
Yes.
then many radio talk shows and podcasts and other situations like that will use that symbol, because an image is worth 1,000 words.
Absolutely. So I'm actually writing a book on that right now. It's called The Politics of the End, Apocalypticism in America. And I think a lot of this falls under the heading of an apocalyptic worldview where it helps them to amp up the stakes, right? It is it's the highest of stakes, right? And so if you have the highest of stakes confronting you, you're willing to do an awful lot, including such, trivial things or seemingly trivial things as voting, donating, and mobilizing. And I think that at least since the 1980s and the rise of the new Christian right, there's been this strange amalgam of messaging where before it was rooted in theology and there were lots of fights over these theological distinctions that are very nuanced and narrow. Now it's an outgrowth of Left Behind, right? It's this pop version of theology that's all that's kind of left is we worry about apocalypse, and it's infused with conspiracy theories. It's infused with some other elements of maybe the far right or the alt right, and so it's this strange kind of witch's brew of messaging that ends up being really, really portable. And you see this in like something like a QAnon conference, where you go to these conferences. I've not personally been, but I've seen video of them where you interview people or journalists would interview people, and it's like this a la carte conspiracy theory. Everybody's worried about something, but as long as it adds up to the same kind of outcome or the same kind of level of support for a particular candidate, it doesn't matter. You can have your own version of that. And I think that it's oddly centralized in some ways, as you suggested, and that these things are being done through conferences that are often quite expensive to go attend, or but also have this sort of horizontal element of it, in that it spreads very widely through, of course, things like internet, 4chan, and the like. So, yeah, I think you're absolutely right that we're seeing a very virulent strand of that right now, or strain of that right now, and it's taking on a very particular kind of character that is somewhat troubling and worrying.
Yeah, by
Really
the way,
fantastic
I
question.
saw a recent image that Rapture is coming again, I think next week. But it's been like 100 times in the past 10 years.
Well, the Millerites thought it was coming in the 1830s, so we'll see if they're right this time.
Yes. Yes. Let's go back to the student
Um,
questions.
Sure, sure, sure. These are fantastic questions, by the way.
Thank you.
One was about political parties change their strategies when voters' opinions change. Absolutely. They not only change position, but they change how they talk about different kinds of things, and some of that is based in rhetoric in terms of how they describe what their agenda actually is or what parts of it they emphasize. So this goes back to a long literature on uh, when parties are able to um, moderate themselves. So it turns out that there are a lot of historical instances where parties in the immediate aftermath of, say, a loss, where a huge chunk of the electorate has moved in the opposite direction of what they were trying to sell to the public, they tend to double down, at least initially, but then finally find their way back to a position where they either outright change their position on certain issues or change the way that they talk about it. So there's lots of tools for the parties to be able to do that, but they absolutely do change tactics and strategies when a significant chunk of the electorate changes their minds. Um, World diversifying and modernizing, becoming more accepting of various religions. Um, that's a really good question. Uh, right now we're seeing a polarization of the American religious marketplace where evangelicals and in particular charismatics are finding a home in the Republican Party, and the party that's actually trying to deal with that diversity is the Democratic Party. They have, African American Protestants who are a fairly religious group as a whole, are firmly within the Democratic coalition, but they have this rising group of seculars who are either outright atheists or what are described as religious nuns. And that I have to spell it out every time when I say it. It's Nones, because it doesn't make any sense to have a religious nun. These are people who on a survey say, I'm not anything in particular. I'm a religious nun. I don't have anything. And so people who describe themselves in those terms are gravitating toward the Democratic Party. So the fight right now seems to be sort of restricted to the Democratic Party. There was a previous fight between sort of the Ayn Rand libertarian contingent of the Republican Party, but they've all basically come to terms with each other. And right now, the kind of tensions that exist right now are on the Democratic side. So it's
They
interesting to
they
see how that plays out.
they made after that three movies, right, with different kinds of atlas,
Mhm.
right? Yeah.
um, Candidate, what are the most important things to do and say? This is a fantastic question. I get actually journalists ask me this quite a bit. Like, what's the thing that has to be in a political ad to make it effective? There isn't one thing. There might be that one thing for a particular campaign, but across time and space, there's not that one thing. And there's a lot of evidence that there isn't that. Like people have taken content analyses of political ads and looked to see which ones are most effective. And there's almost no real patterns that emerge from the data in terms of what is the most effective thing to talk about in a campaign. If I kind of had to speak in more general terms, it would be message control, being able to control what your campaign is putting out there and relying less on outside groups to do that for you because things start to get muddy and the people who are watching the ads or watching campaign appeals are really bad about separating what your campaign is saying from what other kinds of groups who are affiliated with your campaign or aligned with your campaign are saying. And so it's all going to be conflated as this is what that candidate stands for. And so I think that if I were to put my finger on one thing and be forced to say one thing, it's message discipline seems to matter quite a bit. Um, Fantastic questions again. Uh, Advice for students. Did I skip some?
I
Let's
think you
see.
were Julia Donato. How do
Oh,
you?
I'm sorry, I skipped some. I went over her second question. Do you believe in most challenge? That is a fantastic question and opens a gigantic can of worms. I actually don't have a great answer to that.
So
I
what is the
think that
question? The first one, how do you see the role of
it's
religious groups? No.
no, I think I took care of that one with the
All right.
campaigns, the work on presidential leadership. What do you believe are the most significant challenges and opportunities that current and future U.S. presidents face in
Right.
balancing executive power with democratic principles? I think that they're barring a period in which Congress reasserts itself. I think that things have been moving more in the direction of a managerial bureaucracy. And that is, of course, perfectly compatible with democracy, particularly with mass democracy, but might bring to mind worries of kind of an imperial presidency. So I don't see any way back from that right now. And I think that the executive and the broader bureaucracy is going to continue to be, and may become even more so, the main political institution in the United States, absent a resurgent Congress, which the incentives just aren't there for Congress to do that. So that is a fantastic question and one that, um, frankly, I struggle with quite a bit. So sorry for skipping over that. Talk about the key strategies, advice for students wanting to pursue a career in political comms. get involved early, even if it means you're stuffing envelopes. Right? The best experiences that I had were, at least initially, as something of a fly on the wall, where you're there for the decision making, but you aren't necessarily involved. And so I think that that's the most important thing, and that's something that anybody can do. And it can be frustrating because it can take a while to work up the ladder. But if you're continually there and you're dependable, you will be tasked with more things in the future. And I think that that is traditionally how it has worked in the campaign environment or in a comms environment, is that you're there. That being said, I think that technology and technical training is helping to overcome that, and that you can probably start at a higher level if you have skills, say, in well, technology, right? Ad creation, all the various kinds of software that are available for that, whether it's data analysis, data analytics, if you're able to showcase that you can engage in, say, voter targeting, take a voter file, take other kinds of information you would append to that, and come up with a profile of a voter that your campaign needs to target with a particular message. I think that that can be something as well. So today I see kind of two paths. There's the traditional one, work your way up, and the other one is where you have a technical set of skills that you're able to offer to a campaign. Um, Increase the number of young voters to come out and vote. Fantastic question. Uh, so there are some things that work. So sort of pre-registration has been shown to work, registering before the age of 18, getting people in that mindset and prepared in order to participate in politics. I think that's a key way to go about it. But I'm going to quote something from V.O. Key back in the 1960s. Voters get out of campaigns precisely what the campaigns put into them. And if the campaigns aren't directing their communications toward the youth vote, toward the issues that younger people care about, then there's not really that much reason for a lot of people to get involved, or they don't think there's a reason to get involved. So when the campaigns start to change, you'll see that. How do you get the campaigns to change? Well, you showcase that you are a voting bloc that's reliable, and you're a voting bloc that is able to make a difference in certain areas. Then the campaigns start to talk to you because now you're a strategic asset. So part of that would also involve overcoming the collective action problem, convincing other people your age that it's important to participate. And there's a lot of reasons it's important beyond civic duty. There turns out that there's rewards to voting. Places that vote at higher rates tend to get a bigger piece of the pie than places that vote at lower rates. And so thinking of this in terms of collective action, like what can I do to help all of us? And this is one of those things.
So I wanted to interject something here. For example, it seems that this is a problem that feeds itself. For example, candidates are not so much interested in spending time and money in, if they are Democrats in red states, they would attempt something in purple states. But the people who would be more democratic or liberal in red states would say, how can we overcome, even if collecting signatures, organizing people, keeping at it, but never being willing to attract more people, because they say, the younger generation say, these candidates are not interested in us, they're not coming here.
It is absolutely a vicious cycle, and I see this all the time, right? Youth aren't involved, therefore campaigns don't care about them. Campaigns don't care about them. Younger people, younger voters say, well, they're not talking to my needs and my concerns. Why should I care? And it is this vicious cycle that we need to break out of some way. Um, the fantastic question, the second one that individual asks, I think I addressed. There's no one thing that a campaign ad needs in order to connect with voters. If I could speak in generalities, maybe coming off as authentic if we're at that level, but we're now firmly out of my comfort zone, right? That's not something that I can code, and it's something that is radically subjective. The studies I've seen have shown that there's no one thing in an ad that is always and forever effective across time and space. So it ends up being, and this isn't surprising, campaigns need to know what their electorate is looking for, and they need to know how to reach that electorate. And that's going to vary from place to place.
So an ad would be more of a
Uh,
cultural item, so it's more subjective.
I think so. I'm away from the data at this point, but I think that that is the consensus is developing rapidly around that campaigns are subjective in terms of what works and what doesn't.
Yeah.
And what works in one place might not work very well in another. In terms of gerrymandering, yes, it's prevalent. How can it be stopped? There's been a variety of proposals in terms of nonpartisan redistricting commissions. The thing I always tell people that I'm not sure that they like to hear is if you don't like it, you should move. And that's because even if we were to stop gerrymandering today and we'd have a formula that was able to assign things such that we get the most competitive districts that we could, we still have a geographic problem, and that's that Democrats like to live in cities. And there's just no way you can do anything other than pack those districts to be like 80% Democrat. And so they're wasting a lot of vote in the cities. And this has been true for quite some time. And so even if we're able to overcome the strategic elements where parties are able to draw the lines, there's a geographic and a demographic problem, which is you have one party supporters who are more geographically spread out than the other party supporters. So without a radical change in how representation is focused in the United States, I think that that is the only foolproof way to change is that people should move into areas strategically. I realize there are a ton of impediments to doing that, not to think about the people like to live where they like to live for a variety of reasons. But if your only thing you're concerned about is politics, certain people moving would help the gerrymandering problem.
Right. And I was thinking, you say that more democratic people like to live in cities, but I would say cities by default are more diverse, and
Yes,
you would find people with more education in cities than
absolutely.
in
Yep.
rural
And
areas. So that influences their, debunking myths and understanding issues in a different manner. For example,
absolutely.
look what's happening in Springfield, Ohio, by bringing 20,000 Haitians in a population of 60,000 people. But yesterday I saw a report here in St. Louis that we were so proud that in the past 2 years, actually, St. Louis metro area has increased 30,000 more Latin American population. And actually, they would like to be on that trend because that brings more workforce, cheaper workforce, people really interested in making it into America, so they will, work more and be more dedicated. And I understand that this kind of data brings us to number 4 in the country as cities, metro areas with an increase in Latin Americans.
Yeah, the only reason Buffalo, the city I'm currently residing in, has grown and hasn't lost population is foreign born population. It has been predominantly immigrants, and there's been a lot of programs to get immigrants here. There've been a lot of positive outcomes from that, but it goes along with this idea that cities are really one of the only places that that kind of thing can happen. It's not entirely true, right? There was migration to more rural parts of Minnesota in the wake of the Vietnam War. Yeah, there's exceptions, of course, but cities are where that influx can be handled more readily because of infrastructure and because of various opportunities. So yeah, this is not a problem that's going away. You're absolutely right.
Yes.
To think of it as a problem is kind of wrong. It's not an issue that's going away.
Right.
Um, what I look at when I'm looking into voter turnout, um, I think the I look at both, as the article suggested, behavioral and legal institutional aspects, right? I think about the calculus of the individual voter, right? Is this something that matters? Is this something where there are sufficient differences between candidates? And then also sort of the mechanical, how easy is it for me to cast a ballot? And so those two things in combination tend to be what determines voter turnout. It's not the whole ball game. Things like culture come into play. And there are certain places that are just more participatory, and it's really hard to distinguish why that is. Good example is the Upper Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin. There's greater demand for turnout there, and so the institutions are created to admit of greater popular participation in a lot of different things. They like to vote on a lot up there. And so I think that that's, you know, there's a lot of things that go into turnout as a topic. Um, the next one's about abortion in this year's election. Will it sway religious voters toward Trump? Um, that's a really good question. So yes, people who are anti-abortion are certainly going to vote for Trump in greater numbers. That being said, I don't know that they were ever not going to vote for Trump. There's lots of things that go along with that particular attitude that point in the generic Republican candidate direction. And so, as we talked a little bit about before, religious voters or voters who care deeply about that particular issue tend to be fairly captive at this point. And so I don't know that it's really swaying them in that direction. I think that they it could have been part of the reason why they gravitated to where they were politically to begin with. But at this point in time, it's such an issue that is identified with the Republican Party that there's really no movement, right? The people who are going to shift on this have probably shifted beforehand.
Yes, but I would also add that helped by the Supreme Court defeating the Roe versus Wade, has provoked some radicalization on the other side. So, for example, in Missouri, like in a few other states, there are initiatives that will go on ballot this November to actually put in the constitution of the state to allow families to choose their reproductive rights.
So yeah, there's pretty good evidence that in the midterms that the abortion issue in particular was something that redounded to the benefit of Democrats across the board. So um, again, I'm not sure persuasion is going on, but certainly mobilization around that issue on either side because it's been made newly salient by Roe being overturned. I think that there's certainly an opportunity for both sides to mobilize around it. So maybe that's the better way to think about it. Um, Number one rule, I think if I had to pick something in political communication, it's the number one rule. It's that message discipline. You know, having a plan and sticking to it. And this, unfortunately, there's not a lot of data to back up that position, but that's something that seems to track with a campaign that ends up doing well. Um, Second question is kind of complicated. Why do you think religion plays a huge role in policymaking? We have separation of church and state outlined in the Constitution. Um, the wall of separation is actually from Jefferson's letter. What we have is the Establishment Clause, and what constitutes establishment has always been something of a fuzzy concept. As to why we see so much religion in policymaking at a variety of levels, I think it's that the Constitution's what you might refer to as a parchment barrier. It only has teeth if insofar as people are willing to enforce the provisions of it. And if you have a majority that wants things to be a certain way, or even a really entrenched, highly motivated minority who wants things to be a certain way, they will find ways to do that. And I think that that's why we've seen a increasing marriage of religious entanglement, even though we do have an establishment clause that historically, or at least before the last couple compositions of the court, has tried to make a fairly bright line between state and the even the perception of religious entanglement. So I think that it comes down to it has to be enforced, and that enforcement depends on a interpretation being widely agreed upon. It's a good question, though. Um, Parties use social media outlets to benefit their campaign. Yeah, I think both parties are using social media, and if they're not, it's to their detriment, right? Campaigns, in addition to being among the most paranoid kinds of operations I've ever met or encountered, right? They always, think that they've got a lock on the strategy that's going to win, and that their strategy, if they can only keep it from the other side, is the winning one. Never mind the fact that campaigns tend to do precisely the same kinds of things. Right? It's very rare for a campaign to have a strategy that is unknown or unanticipated by the other side. And so both campaigns use technology to the best of their ability. Some might be a little bit out front of that more than others, right? They might lag, but they learn very quickly how to use the tools that are available to the ends that they want. Um, is this new form of instant media good for democracy? Does it bring along more negative effects? I think I'm in the camp, and this is a very normative judgment, that it brings along more negative effects. I think that people get overwhelmed by kind of the constant stream of information. And I think that um, our lizard brains aren't always equipped to deal with the steady stream of information. And yeah, this goes back to a debate between some political scientists and communication scholars a few years back, where they said that it's the media's job to serve as something of an alarm, right? It lets us know that something is really important, and then we can go pay attention to it. We can educate ourselves on the details. The problem is that it's always ringing. It's an alarm that is continually going off. And so we don't know what to pay attention to. We don't know, in some cases, how to pay attention to it most effectively. And we've gotten to a point where we have this polarization of the information environment where you have super consumers who are really, really well informed, and all they do is pay attention to political news. And then you have people who, because they can, and because that alarm is always ringing, tune out entirely. And I don't think we've seen the effects that we hoped we would see from a proliferation of media outlets, a proliferation of technical means to convey information. And we thought that the internet was going to be this boon to democracy. And I don't know that that's actually happened.
So it used to be agenda setting, but now it's always breaking news. It's a crisis situation that makes us tune out because the devil is not so black. You know,
Right. So if the alarm's always ringing, it's hard to know what to pay attention to. And it eventually just becomes noise.
yeah.
Let's see. Insights about the future presidential campaign. Uh, I'm really bad at this, by the way. The prognostication part of this is not me. I used to have a colleague who was a really good at forecasting elections. I'm really bad about the forecasting thing. I think it's going to be tight if we're talking about this campaign, and I think both the fundamentals of the race and the campaigns themselves are fairly evenly matched. Maybe not necessarily in terms of monies, because I think the Democrats are outspending Republicans right now, but I think that there are other ways that Republicans are able to make up that shortfall. So, as with most big national campaigns, I think that they're evenly matched, and it's going to be another close one.
There is a professor, retired professor from Minnesota, who has predicted the most of the elections in the past 20 years. And he says that Kamala Harris will be elected, but following his own formula. So he says, if I will be wrong, then my formula is wrong.
I mean, I think the world's probabilistic, so I never think about it as, that there's a critical case that you're wrong once and the model's wrong. Yeah, I think the world's probabilistic. But yeah, if that's the Lichtman, right? Is that the historian, or is
I,
that the
I
um
don't remember his name now, but I saw it on MSNBC last week. They were
yep,
showing in a little bit of an artistic video, made a little bit funny, how
yeah.
that guy was maintaining himself at 70 something, to have a clear mind, but then he presented himself his formula that was infallible up to now, since he invented it. But and he was calculating again step by step how he will get to the end, to the conclusion, and that's his prediction.
Yep. I'd probably go the same way right now if forced to pick, but it's gonna be close.
Yes. Yes.
Um, Statement in the article about vulnerable Dems look to differentiate themselves. Difficult for candidates to distance themselves from their party's leadership, especially in cases where the president isn't popular. Yes, it is, particularly in an era of very nationalized elections. It's really hard to have a personal brand in a time when the first thing that people know about and care about is the party that you belong to. So at one point, it was probably possible to have a much more localized brand. You know, Joe Manchin was something of the master of this. And rhetoric can help, right? You can use communicative strategies to position yourself in ways. And we're seeing Sherrod Brown doing this right now. You're seeing Tester doing this right now. That being said, it's looking like a strategy that is increasingly more difficult to pull off. Um, how have campaign ads or electoral strategies influenced voter turnout among historically underrepresented groups? Um, So I have looked at ads and turnout. Ads themselves don't seem to do a whole lot with aggregate turnout. I don't know that I've looked downstream at what you might think of as interaction effects with particular types of groups, but ads as a broadcast medium tend to not do a lot to voter turnout in the aggregate. Maybe at the individual level, that's different, but in terms of overall turnout, it's really hard for them to do that. In terms of electoral strategies, there's a lot of evidence that the biggest bang for your buck is ground game, right? Actually knocking on doors, meeting with people. It tends to be more expensive, but you also get the greatest return on investment if you're doing that kind of work. And this is not my work, but this is referencing others' work. If that message is targeted toward a particular group, including an underrepresented group, it's potentially even more effective. So yeah, there is some literature on that.
And this is
And
the very last question, and we are right on
yep,
time.
good, good, good. Sorry, I hope to open up a little bit more. I talked maybe too long, but considering the work on the role of religious identity in electoral politics, how do you see religious influence shaping future U.S. elections? That's a fantastic question. I could go on at length about that. I don't think religion is going away. There is secularization that is happening in the American public. I think we've seen the largest move toward a secular public than we have in quite some time in the last 30 years, really since the early 1990s. That trend has continued apace. I think what we'll see though is people who are religious are going to be deeply so, and it's going to be a larger part of their identity than others. It's just not something they're going to hold on to. That's just another part of their being. It's going to be much more important to them. And I think that's what we're seeing with respect to some of the only places where religion is actually growing is among charismatics. So people who have a fairly strict or conservative view of the faith and believe in sort of living that out on a daily basis. I think that that's where we've seen the most growth in American religious marketplace. And so I do see, like lots of other things, polarization where you'll see strict religions becoming more of a force and more attractive to more people, and you'll see mainline Protestantism, even Catholics to some extent, moving in the opposite direction. And in terms of how that shapes elections, it just feeds into the party polarization, where you have really entrenched religious interest on one side and then much more secular interest on the other political side. Whereas 30 years ago, they were fairly mixed, where you'd have more secular people within the Republican Party and more religious people in the Democratic Party. They've moved and separated themselves over the last 30 years or so. So
So,
really fantastic questions.
so if things get polarized, usually the extremes will become more extreme. But
Yeah.
you don't predict that we're gonna become a state like in the Handmaid's Tale, right?
No, I mean, in spite of the fact that my next book project is called The Politics of the End, I don't see that happening, at least not in the immediate sense. But then again, I don't study civil conflict, so maybe I'm just blissfully unaware of the warning signs that might be out there.
Right. Well,
So
thank you so much for your time. This was a fascinating discussion, and the questions were from the students, so it's like you discussed
great.
with them. Some of them are in public
Sorry
space.
about that.
Some of them are in public spaces, and they wouldn't have been able to be vocal in those spaces. But I always invite them to talk. So, well, anyhow,
If you have an if you have another question, please shoot me an email. Happy to answer via email if something came up that you thought about during the course of the class. Yeah, I'm happy to respond. So please don't be shy about that. And thanks for listening to my to my talk.
Thank you very much for your time. I will make available for the students your PowerPoint presentation and video of this recording.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And
Have a
thank
good
you for
day.
the invite.
Have a good day, everybody.
You too.